The world did not end with a thunderclap. It ended, or perhaps began again, with the smell of salt water and burning wood. Steve Rogers came to consciousness face down in dark sand, the waves of a gray sea dragging at his boots with indifferent persistence. For a moment, suspended between one heartbeat and the next, his body ran its automatic inventory, arms intact, legs intact, the round familiar weight of the shield still strapped to his left arm. The vibranium had shed the seawater cleanly. Everything else about his situation was considerably less clean. He rose, slowly, because the super soldier serum could mend a cracked rib in hours. But it could not prevent him from feeling the crack while it mended. The beach stretched in both directions, rocky, dark, lined with twisted pines that looked like they had been sculpted by a century of cold wind. 50 yards inland, a village was burning. Not dramatically, not with the roar of a fuel fire or the particular shriek of incendiary rounds. It was burning the way things burned when there was no one to stop it. And no one had tried. Methodically, roof by roof, the embers rising in thin orange columns against a sky the color of a bruise. He did not remember how he had arrived here. The last thing he remembered clearly was the quantum tunnel, a test run. Stark had said, perfectly routine. And then the light had done something it was never supposed to do, fracturing sideways instead of forward. And Steve had felt the universe fold around him like a hand closing into a fist. Wherever the tunnel had delivered him, it was not home. He moved toward the village at a measured jog, shield raised, eyes cataloging. The architecture was wrong, stone and thatch. Medieval in a way that wasn't a historical reenactment park, wasn't a simulation. The smell was wrong. The quality of the light was wrong. There was no hum of distant engines. No aircraft contrail in the sky, no power line, no antenna. Just smoke and cold, and the distant sound of men screaming somewhere beyond the tree line. The survivors were clustered near a stone well in the center of the village. A woman with a gash across her cheekbone. Two elderly men, for children who had collectively decided that silence was the only safe response to what they were witnessing. They stared at Steve with the particular look he had learned to recognize. The look of people who had already seen one impossible thing tonight, and were not sure they had the capacity for a second. He held up his free hand, palm open. Easy. I'm not going to hurt you. The language came out wrong. English, which clearly meant nothing to them. But the gesture was universal. And the woman, who had the bearing of someone who had survived worse things than this particular night, studied his face for 3 seconds and made a decision. She spoke. He didn't understand a word. I know, he said quietly. Me neither. He turned toward the tree line, where the screaming had become the specific, rhythmic sound of men on horseback moving at speed. 30 seconds later, they came out of the tree line, soldiers in half-plate armor, mounted, carrying a banner Steve didn't recognize, a crowned stag on gold. Behind them, retreating in poor order, were men in rougher equipment, some of them wounded, all of them afraid. The mounted soldiers pulled up when they saw him. The lead rider, a broad man with a red beard and the unsentimental eyes of someone who gave orders for a living, pointed a gauntlet hand at Steve and said something sharp and interrogatory. Steve looked at the survivors, who were still watching him. He looked at the mounted soldiers, who had the posture of men deciding whether to ride over a problem or around it. He looked at the burning rooftops, at the children behind the well, at the dark line of the sea behind him. All right, he thought. Different world. Same job. He settled the shield on his arm and walked toward the soldiers at a pace that was neither aggressive nor retreating, which was a pace he had spent a considerable portion of his adult life perfecting. If you want to see more characters enter strange new worlds, hit subscribe and drop a name in the comments. May the force be with you, and with the first men. The mounted soldier with the red beard had a name. Steve would learn it later as Ser Colin of Greenpools, a household knight of House Baratheon, but in the immediate moment, the man communicated primarily through volume and repetition, both of which Steve weathered, with the patience of someone who had once sat through 3 consecutive hours of Howard Stark explaining a single engine modification. The soldiers surrounded him in a loose ring, not attacking, assessing. Steve kept his hands visible, the shield angled down and away, and let them look. He had learned long ago that the first 30 seconds of any unexpected encounter were mostly about giving the other party Time to arrive at the conclusion that you were not, in fact, a threat. Sometimes it took longer than 30 seconds. These men were taking closer to 2 minutes, which he counted as a relative success given that he was wearing a uniform that bore no resemblance to anything in their known world and carrying a disc of metal that had just deflected a thrown spear. One of the younger soldiers had tried it, more from nerves than aggression, without so much as a scratch. The spear was lying in the sand. The young soldier was staring at it. Redbeard, Ser Colin, made a decision. He barked an order. 2 soldiers dismounted, and they gestured with drawn swords in a direction. That was clearly come with us rather. Then we are going to kill you here. Steve went. Compliance was not submission. It was information gathering. And right now he needed information. Considerably more than he needed a fight. He couldn't explain the purpose of. They rode through the night. Steve ran alongside the horses without apparent effort, which produced a second round of staring from the soldiers and a muttered conversation. He couldn't follow, but whose general tone he recognized as what is this man and how is he doing that? The serum had always had that effect on people. He was used to it. By dawn, they were approaching a castle. It was nothing like the castles he had seen in books or in the European countryside during the war. Those had been tourist attractions or bombed-out shells, their threat long since drained away by centuries of peace. This castle was functional, unapologetically, aggressively functional. High walls, deep moat, towers positioned for overlapping fields of fire or overlapping fields of arrow shot. He corrected himself, cataloging the archers already visible at the battlements. Someone inside these walls had built this structure to hold against a serious assault and had thought carefully about how to do it. He respected that. The great hall was all dark, wood and firelight and the smell of wood smoke and dogs and roasting meat. At its far end, on a chair that stopped just short of being a throne, sat a man who filled the space around him the way very few men do. Not through physical size alone, though he was substantial, but through the particular density of someone who had never seriously doubted his right to occupy whatever room he was in. Lord Renly Baratheon. Steve would not learn the name for another hour, but he read the man immediately. Charismatic, politically shrewd, performing ease to mass calculation. The smile was genuine in its warmth and genuine in its watchfulness simultaneously. A politician, Steve thought, and then revised it. A lord, which in this world appeared to be the same thing with better armor. Renly looked Steve up and down, the way you look at something you've never seen before but intend to find useful. A young woman stood at his right, dark-haired, armored, with the focused stillness of someone who had trained very hard to be taken seriously in a room that was not inclined to take her seriously. She was watching Steve the way a professional watches a potential threat, not with fear, but with the particular attention of someone running calculations. An older man in a maester's chain sat at a table to the left, surrounded by documents, and he was looking at Steve with something closer to pure scientific hunger, which Steve found considerably more comfortable than the political assessment. Renly spoke at length. Steve understood nothing. The maester cleared his throat, hesitated, and then said, carefully and with a heavy accent, "Do you speak the tongue of the free cities?" Valyrian. Steve shook his head. The maester tried 2 more languages. Steve shook his head twice more. Then the maester sat back, tapped his fingers on the table, and said something to Renly that had the cadence of, well, this is going to take some time. What followed was 3 days. 3 days in which Steve was given a room, adequate food, and a guard who was there more for observation than containment. He could have walked through the door any time, and everyone in the castle knew it, which created an odd equilibrium of mutual restraint. He spent most of that time with the maester, whose name was Lomeis, who approached the language problem with the systematic persistence of a man who had dedicated his life to the accumulation of knowledge and was not going to let a small obstacle like a completely unknown tongue stop him now. By the end of day 1 they had nouns. By the end of day 2 they had verbs and the beginning of a shared grammar. By the end of day 3, Steve could conduct a halting conversation, and Lomeis was looking at him with the expression of a man who had just found an anomaly in his data and didn't yet know if it would break his theory or confirm it. Where? Lomeis said carefully. On the morning of the 4th day. Do you come from? Steve considered the question. He had thought about how to answer it for 72 hours. Far away, he said. A place you don't have maps for. Lomeis absorbed this. He tapped his own arm, indicating the shield. This material. What is it? Something from home. It stopped a crossbow bolt this morning. The maester's voice was perfectly neutral. The bolt shattered. The shield did not mark. I know. Lord Renly, Lomeis said carefully, believes you are a gift. A weapon sent by the Seven, or fortune, or something he doesn't need to name as long as it serves his cause. Steve looked at the maester steadily. What do you believe? Lomeis was quiet for a moment. I believe, he said finally, that you are a man from somewhere I cannot locate, with capabilities I cannot explain, who has not harmed a single person in 4 days despite ample opportunity. He paused. I believe that makes you either very dangerous or very principled. Possibly both. Probably both, Steve agreed. Lord Renly wishes to speak with you this afternoon. He will ask you to ride south with him. The maester folded his hands. I thought you should know before he asks. Steve nodded slowly, looking out the narrow window at the gray stormland sky. Somewhere to the north, the old man had said yesterday, there was a wall. And beyond the wall, something that made the war of lords and thrones look like a dispute. Over a fence line. He was already thinking about the wall. Renly's proposal was exactly what Lomeis had predicted, dressed in exactly the kind of language Steve had expected. Grand, flattering, strategically vague, on the details that mattered and precise only on the details that served Renly's purposes. The Seven had delivered a champion. The realm needed saving from a false king. There would be glory and honor, and a place at the right hand of the true ruler of Westeros. Steve listened to all of it without interrupting, which was a discipline he had developed across decades of meetings with men who confused eloquence with argument. When Renly finished, Steve said, "Tell me about the wall." The silence that followed had a specific texture. It was the silence of a room in which everyone had been prepared for a negotiation and had received instead a question nobody wanted to answer. Renly recovered first. He was good at recovering. The wall is a relic, a remnant of an older age. The Night's Watch maintains it. Good men, dedicated men, but what's beyond it? Another silence. Shorter this time, but denser. The dark-haired woman, Brienne, he had learned. A knight in all, but the title the world refused to give her, spoke for the first time since Steve had entered the hall. Wildlings, she said, with the clipped precision of someone giving a report. Free folk who live beyond the wall's protection. Raiders, occasionally. And she paused. And in the pause, Steve heard something he recognized from other soldiers in other wars. The particular hesitation of someone describing a thing they had seen that they knew they would not be believed about. Stories of things that come with the cold. What kind of things? Dead things, she said. That walk. Renly made a small, dismissive gesture. The gesture of a man who had made a political decision to treat a strategic reality as folklore because acknowledging it was inconvenient. Steve had seen that gesture before. He had seen it in congressional hearings and intelligence briefings, and in the specific body language of every authority figure who had ever decided that a threat was too expensive to take seriously until it was too expensive to ignore. He had never liked the gesture. Lord Renly, he said, in the careful, deliberate tone he used when he was choosing to be very clear, I appreciate the offer. I need more time before I can answer it. Renly studied him. The warmth in the man's face did not disappear. It was too well practiced for that, but something behind it recalibrated. How much time? Enough to understand what I'm being asked to fight for, and what I'm being asked to ignore. He left the hall before Renly could construct a response, which was either bold or rude depending on your perspective. And Steve had long since stopped worrying about which one people decided it was. He went north. Not immediately, and not without preparation. Lomeis, who had the quietly subversive intelligence of a man who had survived multiple lords by being indispensable to all of them, provided what he could, maps, letters of passage that might or might not be respected depending on whose soldiers he encountered, and 3 weeks of intensive language instruction that brought Steve's command of the common tongue from functional to fluent in the particular way that the serum accelerated everything: learning, healing, endurance. as if his body were simply unwilling to waste time. Brienne rode with him for the first 4 days, not by Renly's order and not by Steve's invitation, but by her own decision, which she communicated by appearing at the stable at dawn, on the first morning fully armed and saying nothing that required a response. He did not object. He had been in enough combat to know the difference between someone who was watching you and someone who was watching out for you. And Brienne of Tarth watched out for people the way some people breathe, without apparent effort and without any expectation of acknowledgement. They crossed the Reach's northern edge and into the Riverlands on the 5th day, where the quality of the silence changed. The Riverlands had the specific devastation of a place that had been fought over by multiple armies, none of which considered the land's inhabitants irrelevant factor in their planning. Burned farmsteads, empty villages, the particular hollow look of people who had been taxed and conscripted and pillaged in sequence by forces operating under different banners, but arriving at identical conclusions about whose resources were available for taking. Steve had seen this before. The European theater, 1944, the specific mathematics of a war in which the people doing the dying were never the people doing the deciding. On the 6th day, they found the boy. He was perhaps 12, hiding in the root cellar of a farmhouse that had been burned to its stone foundation. And he had been there long enough that the food he'd taken down with him was gone, and he'd moved on to eating the roots themselves. He came out of the cellar with a knife that he held the way children hold knives when they've decided that dying, fighting is better than the alternative, which meant he'd already seen things that had brought him to that conclusion. Steve crouched down to eye level. It was a thing he had learned, not from training, but from a childhood, of being the smallest person in every room. That people who feel cornered need the person talking to them to be smaller, not larger, he said, in the slow, careful common tongue that Lomaeus had drilled into him. We're not here to take anything. Is there anyone else with you? The boy stared at him, at the shield, at Brienne, back at Steve. My sister, he said finally. She's sick. Her name was Mira. She was 9 years old, and she had a fever that had been running for 4 days, which in this world without antibiotics or field medicine was the kind of fever that resolved in one of two ways. Steve had a small medical kit, one of the items that had survived the quantum tunnel translation, sealed in his uniform's inner pocket, and he used it with the methodical economy of a man who had learned battlefield medicine from the best combat surgeons of the Second World War and refined it across 70 years of subsequent experience. By morning, the fever had broken. The boy, Edric, sat across the small fire from Steve and watched him with the calculating attention of a child who has had to become very good at reading adults quickly. You're not from here, Edric said. It was not a question. No. Where are you from? Steve looked at the fire for a moment. Somewhere the people are different, but the problems are about the same. Edric absorbed this. The dead men came through here, he said. 3 weeks ago, through the Western Pass. Lord Tywin's men said it was wildlings, but it wasn't wildlings. He said it with the flat certainty of an eyewitness. Wildlings bleed. Steve looked at him steadily. These didn't. Brienne, who had been sharpening her sword on the other side of the fire, stopped sharpening. The rasp of the whetstone died in the night air and did not resume. Steve stared into the fire and thought about a wall, built 8,000 years ago by people who had clearly known something that the current generation had decided was legend. He thought about the gesture Renly had made. He thought about a boy eating roots in a cellar because the adults responsible for this world had been too busy fighting over who sat on a chair to notice what was coming down from the north. How far to the neck? He asked Brienne. 8 days' ride, she said. Less, the way you travel. And from the neck to the wall. Another fortnight. Perhaps less if the King's Road is clear. He stood up, settled the shield on his arm, and looked north. The cold was coming from that direction. He could feel it, not just meteorologically, but in the specific way that his body, which had been scientifically optimized to perceive threat, was registering something in the darkness beyond the fire's reach. Something that had been walking south for a very long time. The King's Road was not clear. It hadn't been clear in weeks. Judging by the evidence, an overturned merchant wagon, the horses long since gone or dead, the cargo scattered and partially looted by someone who had been in too much of a hurry to take everything. A contingent of gold cloaks, City Watch. Brienne identified them by the badge, lying in the road in a formation that told a clean story to anyone trained to read a battlefield. They had stopped, they had formed up, and then whatever they had formed up against had gone through them as if the formation were decorative. No arrows, no crossbow bolts. The wounds on the men who had wounds were from blades and blunt force. But several of the bodies showed something that made Steve crouch down and look more carefully. The way he looked at things when he wanted to be sure before he committed to a conclusion. The wounds had not bled. Not the way wounds bleed. The blood was wrong, dark, nearly black, barely present, as if the cold had gotten into the men before the blade had. How long ago, he said. Brienne crouched beside him. The frost on the cloaks. 2 nights, perhaps 3. They were dead before they were killed, Steve said. Brienne was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. That's one way to say it. Edric and Miro were 20 miles south, left in a village with a septon Steve had decided was trustworthy based on the specific quality of the man's fear. Not the fear of someone with something to hide, but the fear of someone who understood exactly what was coming and was determined to stay anyway. Steve had given the septon the last of his medical kit and the gold coin from his uniform pocket that had come through the tunnel with him and would mean nothing here, except that people who didn't know what something was often assigned it considerable value. He had also, before leaving, told Edric something that he had spent a long time deciding whether to say. The people fighting over the throne, he had said. They're not evil, most of them. They're just looking the wrong direction. Edric had considered this with the seriousness that children apply to things adults usually don't bother explaining to them. Are you going to make them look the right way? I'm going to try, Steve had said. That's generally all anyone can do. Castle Black arrived out of the gray northern morning like something a sculptor had made to communicate the concept of endurance. Black, vast, half-ruined, and absolutely, defiantly still occupied. The wall itself was a thing that stopped the eye and then stopped the mind, because the mind required a moment to accept that it was not a natural feature. 800 feet of ancient ice, stretching east and west until it vanished into the horizon. Something had built this. Something had built it because something else had made the building of it necessary. Steve stood at its base for a long moment and felt, for the first time since arriving in this world, genuinely small. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch was a man named Jeor Mormont, compact, gray, with the specific authority of someone who had spent decades being right about things nobody wanted to hear. He received Steve and his solar with the unhurried attention of a man who had seen enough strange things in his life that a stranger in impossible armor ranked as unusual but not unprecedented. He let Steve speak. He asked 3 questions, and then he was quiet for a long time, looking at the maps on his table. You've seen them, he said finally. It was not quite a question. Evidence of them, Steve said. On the King's Road, south of the neck. Something moved in Mormont's expression. Something that had the shape of a man's worst fear being confirmed but not being surprised by its confirmation. How far south? Further than they've been before, I'd estimate. Mormont stood. He walked to the window that looked out at the wall. I have sent ravens to every lord in the 7 kingdoms, he said, with a flatness that was not defeat, but was the thing that sits next to defeat and knows it well. I have sent rangers who have not come back. I have sent reports, testimonies, affidavits, the accounts of men who have looked these things in the eye and survived to write it down. He paused. The response has been consistent. Nobody believed you, Steve said. Nobody wanted to believe me. There is a difference. Mormont turned from the window. And now you're here. A man from nowhere, with a shield that cannot be cut and a body that apparently does not tire, who has traveled from the Stormlands to Castle Black in less time than the ravens. Take. He studied Steve carefully. What do you want, stranger? To help. Everyone who comes to the wall wants something. Glory, escape, redemption. What do you want? Steve thought about Edric in the root cellar, about the gold cloaks on the King's Road, about the gesture Renly had made when the wall came up, that smooth political dismissal that filed a catastrophe under not my immediate problem. I want to do what should have been done before it got this bad, he said. And I want you to tell me everything you know about what we're dealing with. Mormont looked at him for a long time. Then he crossed to a cabinet, produced 2 cups and a bottle of something dark, and sat back down. That, he said, is going to take a while. It took 3 days. 3 days in which Steve sat with Mormont and the senior rangers and the stewards who had kept the watch's records for decades, absorbing everything they had, the nature of the White Walkers, the Whites, the pattern of their movements, the weapons that worked and the weapons that didn't, the dragonglass caches that had been identified and largely left untouched because nobody had quite believed it would come to this. On the second day, a ranger came back from beyond the wall. His name was Thorin Smallwood, and he had been beyond the wall for 6 days, which was 4 days longer than his patrol was supposed to last. He had lost 4 men. He had found something else. He laid it on the table in the solar without ceremony, a broken White Walker blade. The material unlike any metal Steve had seen. Cold in a way that was not the cold of temperature, but the cold of something older. Something that existed at a frequency below the ordinary physics of the world. Steve picked it up. It was cold. It was deeply, profoundly cold, in a way that he could feel even through the serum's temperature regulation. The kind of cold that was less a physical sensation than a philosophical one, like holding a piece of something that had existed before the concept of warmth. He set it back down carefully. Dragonglass kills them, Mormont said. Fire slows them. Steel does nothing. Vibranium, Steve said, half to himself. What? He tapped the shield. The material this is made from. I don't know if it'll work, but it's not like any steel you have here, and I'd like to find out. Mormont studied the shield. How would you propose to find out? The same way you find out anything, Steve said. Go north and test it. Mormont was quiet. Then, with the expression of a man who had spent years making decisions that sent other men into danger and had never found a way to make that feel ordinary. I'll send rangers with you. Send your best ones, Steve said, and get word south. I told you, nobody listens to the ravens. Steve stood, lifting the shield. Then don't send a raven, he said. Send me, after we know what we're dealing with. He looked north through the window, at the wall, at the sky beyond it which was darkening in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. But first, give me a cache of dragonglass. Everything you can spare. Mormont followed his gaze north. The darkness beyond the wall was moving. They went north at first light with 12 rangers for sleds of dragonglass, and a cold that had no business being this severe in what the watches stewards insisted was still technically autumn. Steve felt it from the moment they passed through the gate in the wall. Not just the temperature drop, which was significant, but the quality of the air beyond, which had a stillness to it that was less like weather and more like intention. The forest on the other side of the wall was old. Not old the way forests were old in the world Steve came from, where old meant undisturbed and wild. Old in a different register entirely. Old in the way that things are old when they have been watching. Thorin Smallwood, leading the rangers, said nothing about this. Neither did the other men. Steve understood. These were people who had made a professional discipline of functioning inside of fear. They could not put down and could not afford to let run. He respected that too. They found the first white on the second day. Alone, which Smallwood said was unusual, they moved in groups. Generally, or in the vast coordinated armies that the senior rangers described, in the specific tones of men, recounting something they still weren't sure they had actually seen. This one was solitary, moving through the trees with a mechanical persistence that had nothing of hunger or intention in it, only direction. It had been a man once. A big man, heavy set, in the remnants of what had been common clothes. The eyes were the thing, blue, pale, lit from inside by something that was not life, but was the shape of life. The negative space where life had been. Steve hit it with the shield. The vibranium connected with a force that should have sent a living man 15 feet through the air. The white went further. It hit a tree, came apart at the impact, in a way that was less like a body breaking and more like a structure losing its organizing principle, and then the pieces stopped moving, which was the relevant result. Smallwood stared. It worked. Yes, Steve said, but I need to know if it works on the walkers themselves. He got his answer on the 4th day. They came at dusk, or what passed for dusk this far north. The light declining into a gray that never quite became dark because the darkness here had its own luminosity, a pale cold glow that emanated from the tree lean like foxfire. 3 of them, tall, angular, moving with the unhurried precision of things that understood that nothing they were walking toward would escape them. The Rangers broke. Not from cowardice. Steve would not allow that word for it. Not after watching these men hold their formation for 3 seconds against something that unmade the world's assumptions about what was alive and what wasn't. They broke because the human nervous system, however disciplined, has an honest relationship with things that should not exist. And 3 seconds of discipline under those conditions was its own form of extraordinary courage. Steve did not break. He moved forward. The first walker turned its head toward him with the slow, terrible attention of something that had never been surprised before and was discovering the sensation for the first time. It raised a blade, that same cold material, that philosophical cold, and struck. The vibranium caught it. The impact traveled up Steve's arm like a bell being struck, a resonance that went past physical sensation into something stranger, something that felt like the shield was having an argument with the blade about the fundamental nature of matter. The walker's blade did not shatter. The way Thorin's had at the King's Road, it held, and the walker held, and for a moment the two of them were locked together in a stillness that had a different quality from the stillness of the forest. The stillness of 2 immovable things finding out which one was more immovable. Steve shoved. The walker went back 3 steps. That was all. But 3 steps was something. 3 steps meant physics still applied, which meant the fight was still a fight and not an execution. He went after it. What followed was not a clean battle. Nothing real ever was. The second and third walkers moved to flank, and Steve spent 40 seconds doing the thing he had done in 100 different theaters and 100 different contexts, managing angles, making himself expensive to approach, buying time. The dragging glass was in the sleds with the Rangers, which was poor planning in retrospect, and he filed that away for future reference while simultaneously using the shield to redirect a blade strike toward the second walker, which had the interesting result of the 2 walkers briefly obstructing each other, which suggested they were not perfectly coordinated, which was the most useful tactical intelligence of the entire engagement. Smallwood came back, not alone, 4 Rangers with him, each carrying a dragging glass blade, which were clearly improvised and clearly terrifying to hold, but which the men were holding anyway, with the white-knuckled resolve of people who had decided that the alternative was worse. They hit the walker on the left with 3 daggers simultaneously, which turned out to be sufficient. It came apart the same way the white had, losing its organizing principle, the cold light in its eyes going out between one moment and the next. The other 2 walkers stopped. They looked at Steve, both of them, simultaneously, with the pale blue eyes. And Steve looked back, with the round shield and the exhausted arms and the absolute unwillingness to be the one who stepped back first, which was a quality that had gotten him into an extraordinary amount of trouble over the course of his life, and which he had long since accepted as structural. The walkers withdrew into the tree line. They did not run. They simply turned and walked back into the dark with the same unhurried precision with which they had arrived. Steve stood in the gray northern light and let his breathing slow. They retreated, Smallwood said behind him. The man's voice had the specific quality of someone recalibrating every assumption he had made about the world. They're not mindless, Steve said. They adapted. That's important. He turned. It means they can be outthought, not just outfought. He spent 2 more days north of the wall, moving with the Rangers in a wider pattern, testing what they knew and revising what they didn't. The vibranium shield could disrupt the walkers' attack without dragging glass, but it could not kill one. Dragging glass could kill, but required proximity and precision. Together, the shield creating openings, the dragging glass closing them, the combination worked. It required coordination, trust, and the specific willingness to be the person standing closest to the thing everyone else was trying to get away from. Steve was extremely good at that last part. On the 7th day north of the wall, he turned south. He went to Renly first, not because Renly was the right answer. Steve had no particular confidence that this world had a right answer, sitting in a chair somewhere, but because Renly had an army, and what was coming from the north needed to meet an army before it met a kingdom. Renly received him in a larger tent now, south of Storm's End. The army assembled around it with the particular noisy confidence of soldiers who had not yet been asked to do the thing they'd been assembled to do. The Lord was exactly as Steve had left him, charismatic, watchful, performing certainty in a room full of people who needed to believe it. He listened to Steve's account with the careful attention of a man, listening not for information, but for how to respond to information. The smile stayed present throughout. The eyes made their adjustments behind it. When Steve finished, Renly said, "This changes nothing about the immediate situation." "Joffrey, this changes everything," Steve said. There was no heat in it, just the flat, patient clarity of a man who had been through enough history to know what it looked like when the wrong priority was being protected. Whatever is on that throne, when the army of the dead reaches the trident, is going to be irrelevant. The dead don't care who's king. Renly was quiet. Steve leaned forward. "I'm not asking you to surrender your claim. I'm asking you to send forces north. Rangers, knights, anyone who can hold a weapon. I'm asking you to send ravens to every house, Stark, Lannister, everyone, with the same message. One message. What's coming from the north doesn't distinguish between your banners. Lannister will never make them," Steve said, "or the decision gets made for all of you by something that doesn't negotiate." The tent was very quiet. Brienne, standing at the entrance with her usual watchful stillness, was looking at Steve with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not agreement, exactly. Something more complicated, the look of someone hearing a thing they had believed for a long time said aloud by someone who had earned the standing to say it. Renly looked at his maps, at his assembled army, at the ravens he hadn't sent. Something moved through his face, the calculation dropping away for a moment, and beneath it something younger, less armored, something that was still capable of being genuinely afraid in a productive way. "Write the message," he said finally. "I'll put my seal on it." Steve nodded. He picked up the shield. "One more thing," Renly said. When this is settled, I want you on my council." Steve thought about a quantum tunnel and a life already lived in a different world and an answer he owed. Someone who might not be there to receive it anymore. "Ask me again after," he said. "When it's settled." He walked out into the southern air, which was cold, but ordinarily cold. Cold with temperature rather than intention. And he looked north for a long moment at the distant suggestion of a sky that was darker than the sky to the south, darker in a way that had nothing to do with clouds. Then he started walking. In the end, the ravens went out under Renly's seal. Not all the lords responded. Several didn't believe it. 2 sent scouts who came back, changed in a way that ended the argument. The coalition that formed was fractious, contentious, and held together, largely by the specific gravity of a man in a starred uniform who had no stake in anyone's claim to anything and no patience for the postponement of necessary things. Steve Rogers did not take a seat on any council. He did not swear any oaths. He stood at the threshold between the living and the dead and held the line with a round shield and an unwillingness to yield that was less a tactic than a personality. And the line, improbably, painfully, at enormous cost, held. The wall stood. The world of men survived its longest winter. And somewhere in the gray northern light, between one battle and the next, a man from another world looked at the horizon and understood that the work was never finished, only continued. That had always been true. It was true here too. He had found, after everything, a kind of home in that. May the force be with you.